Eleanor Finch charmed everyone she met. Margaret Holloway saved lives for a living. Marla Dubois was just another quiet woman in town. Betty Grayson fed her neighbors without question, and Evelyn Mercer mourned every loss in her life. But behind their ordinary facades lay something far more sinister. They were cold-blooded killers, leaving behind a trail of bodies in ways so gruesome, so calculated, that even the most seasoned investigators were left horrified. This is the chilling story of the most gruesome female serial killers in history, women who killed not in rage, but with patience, precision, and a darkness no one saw coming. Eleanor Finch was the kind of woman everyone admired. With her neatly pressed dresses, perfectly styled hair, and soft, polite voice, she blended effortlessly into the wealthy suburban neighborhood she called home. To those who knew her, she was elegant and charming, a woman who had endured multiple tragedies yet always carried herself with grace. But behind closed doors, beneath the carefully crafted image, Eleanor hid a secret so horrifying that even the most seasoned detectives would struggle to comprehend it. Her first husband, Richard Finch, disappeared in 1989. Their marriage had seemed happy, though neighbors occasionally heard raised voices from inside their home. When Richard failed to show up for work one day and was never seen again, most assumed he had left Eleanor. She played the role of the grieving wife perfectly, shedding tears for news cameras and pleading for information about his whereabouts. Police found no evidence of foul play, and with no body, no struggle, and no known enemies, the case soon went cold. Eleanor moved on, relocating to another city where she quickly met and married Harold Whitman. He was an older man, wealthy and deeply in love with her. Within a year, Harold also disappeared. His family pushed for an investigation, but once again, Eleanor claimed ignorance. Just like before, there were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, nothing to suggest anything sinister. She cashed in his life insurance policy and moved on. Over the next decade, 2 more husbands followed the same pattern. Each time, Eleanor moved to a new city, reinventing herself with a new name and a new husband. Each time, her partners vanished without explanation. But it wasn't until 2003 that the gruesome truth came to light. A routine home repair exposed a hidden chamber beneath the basement of her latest residence. A plumber called in to fix a leak noticed a strange smell coming from behind a wall. His curiosity led him to investigate further, and what he found sent him running straight to the police. Tucked away behind a false wall were 4 large industrial barrels, their metal surfaces rusted from years of neglect. When authorities arrived and forced the barrels open, they discovered something truly horrific. Inside, perfectly preserved in a sickening mix of chemicals, were the remains of Eleanor's missing husbands. Their bodies were eerily intact, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Each of them still wore their wedding rings, their names etched into the lids of the barrels like trophies. Eleanor was arrested immediately, and as investigators dug deeper into her life, they uncovered chilling evidence of her calculated murders. Toxicology reports revealed that each victim had been poisoned, their deaths slow and agonizing. Experts determined that she had likely drugged them over time, ensuring their bodies could be easily disposed of without struggle. The chemicals she used to preserve them were carefully chosen, suggesting a level of premeditation that made her crimes even more disturbing. The media named her the Blood Widow, a woman who lured men into marriage only to kill them for wealth and control. But even as she sat in an interrogation room, faced with undeniable proof of her crimes, Eleanor never admitted guilt. She simply smiled, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Margaret Holloway had spent years perfecting the image of a dedicated and compassionate nurse. With her warm smile and gentle touch, she was beloved by patients and respected by her colleagues. No one would have ever suspected that beneath her caring demeanor lay a mind driven by a dark obsession, an obsession with control over life and death. For nearly a decade, Margaret silently claimed the lives of her patients, one by one, without ever drawing suspicion. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. At St. Mary's Hospital, where she worked the night shift, deaths among elderly patients began to rise. Most of the victims were already sick, their passing attributed to natural causes. But what no one realized at the time was that many of these patients were not dying of their illnesses. They were being murdered. Margaret had developed a method so precise that even experienced doctors failed to notice anything unusual. She would administer overdoses of insulin, potassium chloride, or muscle relaxants, drugs that could mimic natural decline and cardiac failure. The victims would slip away quietly, their deaths seemingly unremarkable. For years, Margaret operated without raising any alarms. She would often sit beside the beds of her victims in their final moments, holding their hands, whispering words of comfort. She played the role of the devoted nurse perfectly, even shedding tears with grieving families. Some even thanked her for being there in their loved ones' last moments, never realizing that she had orchestrated their deaths. But Margaret's compulsion grew stronger over time. She no longer waited for the elderly or the terminally ill. She began choosing younger patients, those who came in for routine procedures, expecting to walk out of the hospital within days. Her need for control became insatiable. She started testing different drugs, watching closely as each patient reacted. She kept meticulous notes in a small, leather-bound journal hidden in her home, recording details about her victims, their names, ages, the drugs she used, and the precise moment they stopped breathing. Her downfall came in 2005 when 32-year-old Daniel Reeves, a man who had come in for a minor surgery, died unexpectedly after a simple post-op observation. His family demanded an autopsy, and what the medical examiner found sent shockwaves through the hospital. Daniel had received a fatal dose of insulin, despite having no history of diabetes. This discovery led investigators to look deeper into other suspicious deaths, and soon a disturbing pattern emerged. Detectives searched Margaret's home and found her journal, filled with chilling details of over 60 murders. She had documented everything, the dosages, the reactions, even her thoughts on each patient. It was clear that she saw herself as something more than a nurse. She saw herself as a god, deciding who lived and who died. When confronted with the evidence, Margaret remained eerily calm. She neither confessed nor denied the accusations, only tilting her head slightly as if amused by the investigation. It was only in court, when her journal was read aloud, that the full horror of her actions became clear. The media named her the Nurse of Death, a woman who turned a place of healing into her personal hunting ground. For years, young women had been disappearing from small towns across Louisiana, vanishing without a trace. They all shared similar characteristics: petite, dark-haired, often alone when last seen. The cases never seemed connected at first, scattered across different cities with no clear link. Families searched desperately for their daughters, but with no bodies, no witnesses, and no evidence, authorities could do little. Then in 2014, an anonymous tip led police to an abandoned house deep in the bayou, a place so overgrown with vines and moss that it was almost invisible from the road. The house had belonged to Marla Dubois, a quiet and unassuming woman who had worked as a seamstress in town before disappearing years earlier. She had no family, no friends, just a reputation for keeping to herself. When she vanished, no one thought much of it. But what investigators found inside her home revealed a horror that had gone undetected for nearly 2 decades. The front room was filled with mannequins, each one posed in eerie, lifelike positions. Some wore elaborate dresses, others simple nightgowns. But it wasn't until officers stepped closer that they realized the truth. These were no ordinary mannequins. Their skin was real, stitched together from the bodies of her victims. Their hair was human, their nails neatly painted, their glassy eyes eerily lifelike. Each one had been carefully preserved, turned into grotesque, human-like dolls. Beneath the floorboards, investigators uncovered dozens of bones, haphazardly buried. Some were old, yellowed with time, while others were fresh, the remains of victims taken within the past year. A hidden back room revealed sewing tools stained with blood, long strands of hair coiled into bundles, and photographs of missing women pinned to the walls. Marla had been stalking her victims for weeks, watching them, learning their routines before striking. She didn't just kill them, she transformed them, turning them into part of her twisted collection. As police combed through the remains, they identified at least 25 victims, though experts believe the true number could be much higher. Some bodies were too damaged to identify, their faces removed, their identities erased. What made the case even more disturbing was that Marla had vanished without a trace. There were no records of her leaving the country, no activity on her bank accounts. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Some believed she had died years earlier, possibly taking her own life, while others feared she was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The media dubbed her the Collector, a woman who saw human life as nothing more than material for her grotesque art. To this day, her whereabouts remain unknown. The house was demolished, but some locals swear that at night they still see figures moving among the trees, mannequins that shouldn't be there, their lifeless eyes watching from the shadows. Elmwood was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Families lived in peaceful isolation, tending to their farms and running small businesses, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name and doors were left unlocked at night. But in the late 1970s, that sense of safety was shattered when human remains began turning up in the most unexpected places, mixed in with animal carcasses at local farms. At first, the discoveries were dismissed as accidents. Stray bones, perhaps left behind by hunters or scavenging animals, but as more remains surfaced, it became impossible to ignore. Human teeth among cow bones, a severed hand mistaken for a pig's foot, strips of flesh found in slaughterhouses. Someone was butchering people and disposing of them like livestock. For years, the community lived in fear, yet no one could pinpoint a suspect. The killings were methodical, life with no pattern to the victims. Some were drifters, others were local farmhands, and a few were just people passing through town. With no bodies ever fully recovered and no signs of struggle, the police had little to work with. But in 1983, a routine health inspection at a small, family-owned butcher shop led to a horrifying revelation. The inspector noticed something off about the meat, a strange texture, an unusual color. Further testing confirmed the worst. It wasn't just pork and beef being sold at Betty Grayson's butcher shop. It was human flesh. Betty Grayson had lived in Elmwood her entire life. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, known for her sharp business sense and no-nonsense attitude. She ran the town's only butcher shop, a place where locals had bought their meat for decades. No one had ever suspected her. She was friendly but private, hard-working but unremarkable. Yet, for nearly 15 years, she had been luring victims to her farm, killing them, and processing their bodies like cattle. The barn on her property held evidence of her gruesome work: chains stained with blood, a rusted meat grinder, knives worn down from years of use. A freezer in the back was stocked with neatly wrapped packages of meat, some labeled with strange codes that investigators later realized were her victims' initials. She had been selling human meat to unsuspecting customers for years, mixing it with pork and beef to hide the truth. When questioned, Betty showed no remorse. She claimed she had done nothing wrong, insisting that people wasted too much and that meat was meat, no matter where it came from. She viewed her victims as nothing more than a resource, choosing them carefully to ensure they wouldn't be missed. Her trial shocked the nation, with survivors of missing persons breaking down in court as the horrifying details of their loved ones' fates were revealed. Betty was sentenced to life in prison, but she never admitted guilt. She remained calm, even smiling as she was led away. To this day, some locals refuse to talk about her, refusing to acknowledge the years they unknowingly consumed her victims. The town of Elmwood would never be the same again. The case of Evelyn Mercer was one that haunted investigators for years. A former schoolteacher with a reputation for kindness, she was the last person anyone would suspect of murder. But beneath her soft-spoken demeanor was a predator who thrived on deception, slowly poisoning those closest to her for reasons no one could fully understand. Her crimes began in 1991 when her husband, Thomas Mercer, a retired banker, suddenly fell ill. His symptoms were vague at first: fatigue, nausea, and muscle pain, but over the course of months his condition worsened. Doctors were baffled as his organs began to fail. By the time he died, his body had deteriorated so severely that an autopsy seemed unnecessary. His death certificate listed natural causes, and Evelyn collected his life insurance without question. No one thought anything of it until a year later when Evelyn's sister Margaret, who had been staying with her, developed the exact same symptoms. Within weeks, she was dead. Again, the cause of death was ruled as organ failure. Again, no one suspected foul play. But then, in the years that followed, the pattern repeated. A neighbor who had frequently visited Evelyn for tea died suddenly, her body showing the same mysterious signs of poisoning. A young woman whom Evelyn had mentored in her teaching days passed away unexpectedly after visiting her home for dinner. Even a postal worker who often delivered her mail was found dead in his car, his body showing early signs of toxic exposure. For over a decade, people around Evelyn kept dying, and yet she remained completely untouched by suspicion. She played the role of a grieving widow, a heartbroken sister, a devastated friend. She attended every funeral, shed tears for every loss, and continued living her quiet, unassuming life. No one saw the common thread connecting the deaths. It wasn't until 2004 that her crimes were finally exposed. A distant relative, Julia Morgan, came to stay with Evelyn for a few months after suffering a financial setback. Within weeks, she became violently ill. Unlike Evelyn's previous victims, Julia survived long enough to seek medical attention. When doctors ran toxicology tests, they found high levels of thallium, a deadly poison, in her bloodstream. Authorities exhumed the bodies of Evelyn's past victims and discovered traces of the same toxin in each of them. The evidence was overwhelming. When police searched her home, they found a small collection of antique medicine bottles, some still containing traces of thallium sulfate, a substance once used as rat poison. It had been slowly added to food and drinks, allowing Evelyn to kill without arousing suspicion. When confronted, Evelyn remained eerily calm. She never confessed, never offered a motive. Some believed she was driven by greed, others thought she simply enjoyed watching her victims suffer. But the most chilling theory was that she did it for no reason at all. That the killings were random, an experiment in how easily she could get away with murder. The media called her the Silent Death, a woman whose victims never saw her coming. Even behind bars, she never spoke of her crimes, taking her secrets with her to the grave.